rewarding conversation today is with Rachel Gibbs, founder, Meritis Consulting, and an ambassador for the Pay Transparency Alliance. Rachel, you're a pay transparency advocate, so thank you so much for giving of your time for this chat.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be invited. It's great to catch up again. Thank you.
Likewise. Let's start with the basics. It would be very helpful. This is such an important area, but there's always a danger that things become buzz phrases, pay transparency. Could you give us your take? How should we define the notion of pay transparency?
I haven't got a slick definition of it. What I do know is it's designed to, and this I'm talking particularly about the EU directive, designed to address the pay information asymmetry between employers and employees. And it does that through a number of mechanisms, which I can share with you later. But the idea is that the intention is to deliver pay equity. And as you'll know, that's different from pay equality and other elements of gender pay gap. They're all completely different. But that's what pay transparency is designed to deliver. And it does that through increased information provided to employees by the employer, which previously has been a little bit more secretive.
Well, indeed.
Yeah.
And again, it's interesting because certain organizations, always particularly those, say, in public sector, unionized sectors, have traditionally been required in a way to be transparent. They have published pay scales, etc., etc. But even there, it's the way things get interpreted. And as you rightly say, that information asymmetry, the employer knows more than the employee. And if we are trying to bring equity to bear in what obviously is a foundational issue for most of us, we need to get paid to pay the bills and to advance in our lives. And therefore, the more we can have some balance between employer and employee, it can't be a bad thing, can it? Why do you think it's become so important then as a topic within recent years? And well, in particular, I think in the past 3 or 4 years.
I don't know for sure. Part of it has come out of the 2020, the 2000 Millennium objectives or requirements from the UN, and there are quite a few there that touch women's enfranchisement. And then additionally, the World Bank has done some research and it found that if women were paid fairly, how much of an impact that would have to GDP, for instance. So I don't know if it's a pure economic and social driver, but certainly those two aspects have had quite an impact from some of the reading I've done.
That's very interesting. And as ever, therefore, if large institutions have got involved, that can raise the level of interest and awareness. It's brought it to the fore. As you said, as part of opening remarks with the EU directive, and we'll come on to that, that's added yet another institutional sort of underpinning. But before we leave our definitional area, could you talk about the common misconceptions, maybe even distortions in terms of, well, the theory, if you like, as well as the practice around pay transparency that people interested in the area, really wanting to get to grips with it meaningfully, ought to be aware of and to think about?
For me, there are two significant elements. One is around pay equity and what that means, and the other is the gender pay gap. And pay equity isn't that everyone gets paid the same. We're not leading to a communist environment, but what it does do is seek to ensure that people are paid for work of equal value, same work or work of equal value. And that's really significant because that enables you to look across the organisation and look at where employees are doing valued work based on some form of points, job evaluation, levelling system, and are they being paid in accordance with a criteria that the company sets out. And that should be gender neutral. but those are the key factors behind equal work of equal value. The other is gender pay gap, and this looks at progress of women through the organisation, and you can have pay equity, and you can still have a complete pay equity across the organisation, but you can still have a gender pay gap if, for instance, women haven't been progressing as quickly through their careers and through the organisation. And many people seem to think they're interchangeable, and they also think that if we solve pay equity, that gender pay gap will be solved. It won't, because some of the factors affecting the gender pay gap are systemic, such as access to childcare and elder care facilities, not access but also responsibility, and those are societal issues, whereas pay equity is clearly an organisational issue. So the two are quite different, and quite often people stumble over them and think they're interchangeable.
Which is why it's great to have the interplay here of theory versus practice. Whilst in theory, we can come up with norms, structures, job evaluation principles that provide for the notion, at least in theory, of equal pay for work of equal value. Once we've decided what those are, how you get to it, and the values you place on it, but then the practicalities, and as you rightly say, it's more systemic. One of the things in our textbook, as you know, we've tried to adopt a systems-based approach and thinking about things in terms of open systems. And I think that's really important here when, as you say, there are the structural inequalities that impact on people's careers differently based upon gender, but obviously a range of protected characteristics. So we need to get people thinking about that. And I think from the point of view of professionals who are there to advise the decision takers in the line, that at least they can get their heads around it and then have the kind of language to be able to articulate it more effectively, both in theory and practice. Thank you for that clarification. That's really helpful. Could we then jump in with both feet? Clearly, they're in the forefront now. We have the EU directive. I understand that there's going to be about a year to put things in place so that by June 2026, employers need to be able to demonstrate that they have met the requirements for pay transparency. Could you talk about some of the issues then that organisations face in preparing for that? There's the positive argument, and I'm sure as an ambassador, you're rightly going to advance that. Could you also talk about the fact that there may be unintended consequences? As with many great initiatives, we set out with best of intentions. What should people look out for in terms of unintended consequences for the unwary or those just playing lip service?
Yeah, now this is summed up in a really great paper by Zoe Cullen, who's at Harvard. She has a paper called Is Pay Transparency a Good Thing? She never answers the question, but within the paper, and it's not terribly long, she comes up with a few examples of unintended consequences. So I will share some of my anecdotes, but I would also refer people to that paper. One of the things particularly that Zoe mentions is that two things. One is it will strengthen the employer's negotiating hand, which seems counterintuitive, but the reality will be that budgets are limited, and employers, once they've got their pay equity in a good shape, they are collectively arguing across a whole organisation, and it will strengthen their position. The other thing she talks about is that there'll be a move to the median. So as there's more information about what competitors are paying, employers are going to start to think, well, I don't need to pay anymore because that's what the market's demanding. And this kind of war for talent will move in a slightly different direction. It'll move more towards employee value propositions, which we know are already important. And it'll kind of strengthen employers' knowledge and move them into more of a cohesive position around pay, as I say, more towards the market medium. The other thing that's going to be interesting is some people are born negotiators, and if you have a set salary range and someone is really thinks they're special, and the hiring manager thinks they're special, negotiations for a new role are going to get really tricky, and there'll be a lot of discussions around minor points such as benefits, but the European directive covers that as a factor in terms of reporting for their gender pay gap reporting. They look at complementary, which is benefits. So it's going to kind of make that whole negotiation process more difficult, particularly with people who are very skilled negotiators, trying to get them on into the organisation, but keep everything kind of ticking along nicely, which that's going to cause quite a lot of tension within the organisation, I think.
As you say, one always has to factor in the differences that people bring in terms of their negotiating capacity. And we need to make sure that people are not able to hoodwink others in that. Well, we go right back, I think, to the work of Hill Bedend back in the 1950s, the effort-reward bargain, something that certainly in our writings, Sarah Jones and I have wanted to reflect on, and that it's this constant process of bargaining, bargaining not just between the employer and the employee at all the various levels, from company policy down to the first line manager and individual, but actually in our own heads. People often talk about the way in which people, say with their imposter syndrome, don't necessarily bargain with themselves to get the kind of recognition that they rightly deserve. So I think that's a really, really important factor.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing then that will be really helpful, you talked about the value proposition. In the US for a lot of time now, they've been talking about this total rewards concept, or sometimes it is the employee or employer value proposition to the employee. Again, there's a danger that that becomes part of just jargon. When Duncan Brown and I were chatting, he was making the point that for him it's almost become a meaningless term. Then Jim Fickus, who obviously with World at Work, they've been synonymous with this. Jim, I think, still makes the case for thinking about total rewards. It's not just a salary or even salary and bonus, but the wider benefits, and those benefits extend beyond the immediate financial or financially convertible aspects. So I wonder how we should think about a value proposition in the context of pay transparency, when we're just actually saying it's not just pay.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's going to blur the lines, particularly where you I mean, one of the problem challenges is going to be collecting the data to do this for the directive requirements. But I think as well, the directive has a number of teeth to it, and one is the right to information. So as an employee from June 26 onwards, you'll be able to request knowledge of where you sit in the range and what the average male and female in the range are earning alongside you, and that's by work of equal value. And my instinct is, and so people are talking about doing total reward statements as a way of capturing this, but it doesn't capture the right to information. And if I was a recipient of a right to information that showed I was very low in the range, and that women were earning significantly less than men, this is your worst case scenario, of course, I wouldn't care what my total. I think the fact is, I don't care about my total reward. And it goes back to what you were saying about knowledge and perceptions of my own worth. And at that point, when I see the right to information for myself, and I can't justify it, and my line manager can't justify it, where I am on the range, I think I don't care about my total reward. I care about where I fit within the organisation, and I think that's a big change that isn't being talked about in the same way.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I've often talked about the notion of the smart basics, and I think that's exactly what this is. We need to be smart about the basics, and as you rightly say, if people feel that they're inequitably treated,
Yeah.
and particularly once then that becomes revealed through the access requirements, it would be very easy well, on the one hand, as we say with total reward statements, to seek almost to massage to distract people, but actually you're not going to take people away from that thing that's to the forefront of their mind and could become a big distraction then if we're talking about, the usual trinity, let's attract, retain and motivate people. Well, if I actually feel there's something rotten at the core, then that's probably not going to have the best of effects. So if we're thinking then about pay transparency, it sounds as though there are potential disbenefits almost at the start for employees. They could be made to feel negative about it, but possibly will be able, if they can use this effectively, whether it's in a collective bargaining situation with their advocates or people advocating for themselves. As you said, the good negotiators versus the others. But then there's also the notion of, well, what are the benefits as well as the drawbacks for employers? Could you just talk about that tightrope between how one can approach pay transparency with the smart basics in mind from an employee perspective and an employer perspective?
From an employer perspective, it's about getting the fundamentals right. So you have you've worked out where your work of equal value is, so you have clarity on that. And then from there, then you look at your pay equity across the work of equal value. And at the time we're recording this, which is at the end of 2024, we just had the result from the next case in the UK, next retailer. It's going to appeal, and possibly if people listen to this later, things will have moved on. But at the moment, what they did within Next was they looked at work of equal value, the guys in the logistics and predominantly women on the shop floor. And the organisation's argument that the retail positions were paid less than the logistics was found to be inequitable because work of equal value across the organisation wasn't being applied. And so it was inequitable pay. And I always think about this. There's 3,500 people who've taken this case on. They've waited 7 years. They still haven't resolved it. But some marriages don't last that long, and people care about this. And if anyone thinks that they don't, they're in for a shock. So I've kind of lost my thread a bit. So yes, getting those basics right, getting your job leveling sorted, getting your pay equity sorted, and then communicating how those decisions have been made are really fundamental. It's kind of three key parts. If you can't do that, then there's a potential issue that you might face. But those are the basics.
It's really interesting, yes. So as you say, make sure that the structures and the processes are in place. Make sure that you are able effectively to communicate what is in place and why. It isn't just the what, it's why, and enabling people to understand that, and then leading fundamentally to a sense, and that's what it comes down to, that people feel they are being given a fair deal. We used to talk, didn't we, about fair days pay for a fair day's work. And that takes us back almost to the 1950s, 1960s. In that sense, things haven't moved on because equity is something that is embedded in human interaction.
Yeah.
Some people, of course, bring into this, and I've listened to some individuals saying, but hang on, what about the role for the market, particularly where we are, say, looking at logistics operations versus the shop floor. In the city of Birmingham example, in the public sector, we have the people handling refuse compared with people who are cleaning offices. Won't pay settle at what the unseen or invisible hand, Adam Smith wise, of the market brings to bear? Are we not interfering. I've even heard the case made that this is a Marxian plot. It's the labour theory of value, that this inherent labour, something that's been debunked over the decades. I say, what's your reaction to people as well? I'm going to cite the market argument.
Yeah, I think this was what came out of the next case, was that the market was reinforcing gender inequality, not gender inequality, pay inequality, because that was the argument that next lawyers took. Yeah, I think this is the thing that most people haven't realised, is it's going to change the emphasis. I've spent a lot of time working in compensation and benefits, and it's predominantly been facing externally, looking at what the benchmark data suggests. And then when I do a pay review, for instance, I've looked within similar jobs, not necessarily work of equal value. I've certainly looked at similar jobs to make sure that people are getting equitable increases, checked for maternity, is everything being done fairly and applied on a fair basis. That will change. Now, if you do a pay review, you have to look across your job levels to make sure that it's being applied equitably, that people are being paid equitably. And I think most comp and ben people haven't realised this is a fundamental shift. I think it's a bit like Fordism and McDonaldization. It's another big switch that's happening in HR perspective, from a HR perspective, how we approach this. It is limited to the EU because of these substantial penalties and costs and other factors that they've put into the directive. It will have a trickle effect to the rest of Europe, UK, Switzerland, for instance. How far it goes, whether it affects directly over the Atlantic, I don't think so much, but it will slightly because of some of the international organisations. Novartis, for instance, have said that they're going to use the directive as their global standard for pay equity across the whole of their organisation. It won't reach everywhere, but it'll tentacles into other countries.
At the very least, if it opens the basis for a more informed discussion, because I think about our approach to reward or compensation management in corporate governance terms. And if we go back to Cadbury's core principles, you either comply or you explain. And in this case, comply with the directive or explain and be willing to give the evidence to show why it is that you need to depart from these principles. So, I mean, if nothing else, it can open a healthy debate and require people to engage with it, and engage with it, as we said earlier on, from a better informed point of view, rather than the disparity of information. Just asking you perhaps to think about this in terms of some of the technicalities of reward management. And obviously we have things, yes, we have the underlying basis of job evaluation, we have graded pay systems and scales that are associated with that. Job families have become fairly favoured. Broad banding schemes, well, they seem to blow in and out, it seems to me, with the wind sometimes. Yes, it's the way, but then we start putting in sub bands within the broad bands. Again, for the people who look at this, they may get a little bit goggle-eyed and clearly be turning to experts to advise them. It's yet another layer to think about. What are your thoughts then about, okay, we've got these various techniques. If we're changing the principles fundamentally with the notion of pay transparency behind it, what at least are some of the questions that a well-intentioned employer ought to be asking, not just to make sure they don't fall foul of the directive, but that they are doing what for them will make them a preferred employer?
Some of it's around employee value proposition. And I mean, it's interesting where we are at the moment. There's a lot of debate about hybrid versus remote versus completely office-based. And every time an employer is pushing people to go back to the office, employees lose flexibility, they increase their costs. And for most people, that's very unattractive. If they really loved working in the office, they'd be there 5 days a week already. And and so you've kind of got these push towards the median, as we know, with pay transparency, and on the flip side, kind of employers are trying to push employees towards a more regimented approach for their own, for the corporate advantage. You know, you can't have both, I suppose, is where I'm thinking. And in practicality, one of those has to give if you want to be an attractive employer, as well as, you know, pool tables and pizzas and another kind of slightly silly things. It's more the basics around good work that people find challenging, and environment that they find rewarding, you know, satisfying to work in, whether that's home-based, hybrid, or office-based. So all those factors kind of come together.
Yes. So again, it's something where people need to be able to step back, see the big picture, make the strategic choice where they want to be, and accept there will be trade-offs of that, and then be able to communicate it. It's interesting that you've mentioned now the whole notion of hybrid working, office-based working, in the conversation with Claire Morgan. The phrase agile working was used. Now, I previously thought about agile as an approach to managing business operations, but it seems that that also has entered the lexicon, defined in terms of the hybrid approach. What I tend to, I quite like the idea of agility. It's good. We want agile people in highly dynamic circumstances. Surely that's good for any organisation and employer as well as the individual. But what it strikes me is that there again, it's about having the more balanced dialogue. So if it's a true effort reward bargain in our heads as well as in conversations with our employers, we can't have adult conversations, as the phrase goes, unless both parties have equal access to the information. So in an interesting way, this is the point. Pay transparency doesn't necessarily just mean, well, you know, we're trying to level up. What it does mean is to say that, of course, taking account of the point, as you said, some people will bargain more effectively than others, but at least people are doing it on a more leveled information playing field.
Absolutely, yeah, that's going to be the big difference, and it's going to change perspectives very much. So, yeah.
Yeah, so perspective. So we need to make sure that just as with forms of technology, we don't allow Luddite attitudes among employers, or indeed employees, or indeed people seeking to represent in between, come in and seek to wreck the mechanisms that can certainly enhance or make more effective, perhaps, the way people do communicate around pay and wider reward.